Hey guys, it's Courtney. I'm back with another card for Newton's Nook. Today I'm going to be using the Garden Mice stamp set as well as the Dainty Daisies. I'm going to bring out my Misty here because I am going to be creating a scene and it's just easier for me for placement to use my Misty. I have all of my masks pre-cut, so I'm just going to kind of arrange those onto my panel for placement reasons before I actually do my stamping. Sometimes I just go right in stamping, but here it's a little bit more particular as to where I need to put things. So I'm going to be basically be creating a little garden here. So I'm going to have this one little mouse on top of this little mushroom chasing this butterfly. So he's on top of the mushroom, he's going to need to be stamped first. And I was going to stamp the other two mice on either side with their flowers, but they wouldn't fit without kind of overlapping each other. So I ended up having just to stamp this little mouse with the butterfly first. I went ahead and removed my masks to get them out of the way, and I'll go ahead and stamp him out with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. And also this is a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to 5.5 by 4.25. So I went ahead and stamped him out, and I did go ahead and mask him. I am using Simon Says Stamp masking paper, but I'm not going to be doing any ink blending, so you can really mask with whatever you have. I did cut my masks out separate for both the butterfly and the mouse, and then I'm going to go ahead and stamp these two on either side with their little flowers and mask those out as well. I'm saving the mushroom for last because that's going to kind of be behind these two. So whatever images you want to be in front of another, you'll need to stamp and mask that first. Oops, sorry. I guess I had to readjust my camera there. So I went ahead, like I said, stamped those out, masked those out. Some of these images are a little intricate and can be a little bit difficult to mask and get them perfect. But like I said, I'm not doing any ink blending in the background, so lining up my masks perfectly was not a necessity for this particular card. So once I had those masked out, I'll go ahead and place down my little mouse with the mushroom, making sure that the mouse above it, his little feet are on top of the mushroom evenly to make it look as if he is standing on top. Stamp that out, and again, mask that with that same Simon Says Stamp masking paper. And in order to make this look like a garden, I need there to be more than just these two flowers. I need there to be flowers behind my little mice. So I'm going to bring out the stamp from the Dainty Daisies stamp set, and I'm just going to go ahead and stamp that as if there's a row of daisies behind my little mice. I'm not worried about masking. I'm just going to line these up so that they don't overlap each other. I don't care if they go over my mice, obviously, because that part is masked. But to be honest with you, this is pretty intricate, and I just didn't feel like cutting any more masks. So I stamped the full image twice, and then I'll kind of arrange just the corners or the one little side of the image to get those little sides of my card panel where there's a little bit of blank space. Once all of my stamping was finally complete, I will go ahead and remove all of my masks very carefully because I'm using the Simon Says Stamp masking paper. It is pretty tacky, so I kind of get it started with just the tip of my scissors and then carefully peel that back so I don't tear my paper as I'm peeling these off. And this actually doesn't, it looks like a big mess. It looks like an adult coloring book, which we've kind of created, but it's a fun one to create. So I did fix up a few areas that I didn't stamp all that great with an EK Success journaling pen, which is a Copic safe pen, and then we'll jump right into the coloring. And I have certain parts of the coloring sped up a little bit. Otherwise, this video would have been about 2.5 hours long. And I didn't think you guys would want to sit here for 2.5 hours. So I'm going to start off with this first mouse here, and I used cool gray markers for all 4 of the mice. Here, I'm starting with this C7 as my darkest color. I'm just adding some shading on his little ear that is behind his head, on the base of his little face, or more towards like his chin, and where his arm is kind of extended out, the base of his tail, I guess. And then underneath his little back feet, extending that out with the C5, then the C3, then the C1. For the others or some of the other mice, I used the C5 as my darkest color and only used a 3-color blend just to have a little bit of variation so that not all of my mice looked exactly the same. I took an R21 marker to add a little bit of color to the inside of his ears. On his little belly, I just skipped the darker colors and I just had that be kind of like a lighter gray. I'm going to also go over that area with that R21 and then back over it with the C1 to kind of tone it down a little bit. I used the C7 on his nose, which I wish I wouldn't have done. I wish I would have made his nose pink or a little bit grayed out pink, if that makes sense, but I didn't, and it is what it is. He looks more like a koala to me, but once everything is colored, it will be fine. So I'm going to kind of speed this up a little bit because I pretty much colored these the same, again, with the same color combinations. Sometimes I'm bringing in that C7 as my darkest color, but in this case, I'm bringing in the C5 as my darkest color, just so this mouse will be a little bit lighter than that first one. I do add that R21 to the inside of his ears and then go over that again with that C1 just to kind of tone that down a little bit. For this next mouse, I am going to bring back out that C7 as my darkest color so that he's a little bit different than the mouse next to him. Again, just adding shading on the base of his little feet and underneath his little nose there. And kind of where his ears start to come up, I'll kind of make the tips of his ears be the lightest. And again, making his belly a little bit lighter than the rest of his body. I will go over that with that R21 and then tone that down with the C1 again, just like I did with that first one. I did forget to add a shadow where the stem of the flower is hanging over his little face. So once I have the coloring done of this mouse, I did go back in with the C5, C3, and C1 just to add a little bit of a shadow off to the left-hand side of that stem, just to kind of add a little bit of dimension there to make it look more 3D. So for this fourth and final mouse, again, I'm going to go ahead and leave that C7 out and start with that C5 as the darkest color. This one is in a very similar position as the first mouse we colored, except he's facing the opposite direction. So I'm going to use the same color combinations here, same thing with his little belly there, and that R21 for the belly and the inside of his ears. Once they were all colored, I realized that I did not like their noses being gray. So I went over their noses with that R21 to kind of have a little bit of a pink showing. It's not going to completely cover up that C marker that we use for their noses, but a little bit of that pink will shine through, and I liked that much better. So moving on to the stem and leaves of this first flower here, going in with my lightest color to get the paper saturated. And then for the leaves, I am concentrating my darkest areas being on the base of the leaf, as well as the the tip of the leaf. You can see that these leaves are kind of bowed out and bent. So I'm placing my shading on either side, making my highlight be in the center of that leaf, and that will kind of keep that shape that the leaf is actually supposed to be. Also creating a shadow where this little mouse is kind of hanging over that one leaf or holding onto it. Same thing with the stem, just making sure that I don't put two dark areas directly next to one another, or else they kind of get lost. For the flower itself, I'm going to bring in some, actually I colored the other stem for the other flower, for the other mouse here with the same color combination. There's no leaves for this one, so you really could probably skip the shading altogether, but I just added a little bit of shading underneath where the stem attaches to the flower itself, as well as underneath where he is holding it. His hands would cast a shadow onto that stem. So now we will jump into the flowers. For this first flower here, I'm going to bring in some RV markers, and I used 5 here, and that's just because I have a hard time with this RV combination. Sometimes they can be a little bit difficult to blend, so I find bringing in just a 5th color helps me out a little bit. So if you guys have the same problem with RV markers, or especially this color combination, you're not alone. I'm just adding some shading on the base of each of the petals and where one petal is laying behind another, extending that out each time. I am using flicking motions, but by no means am I looking for this flower to look realistic. This is obviously not a realistic looking scene. Going to bring in some V markers for this next flower here. Again, concentrating my shading being on the base of the leaves where they're coming out from the center of the flower. Some of the petals are kind of bent over. So where they are bent, I'm also creating a shadow under that bend, and where they're bent up on top of itself. So let me rephrase that. Some are bent under and some are bent over. The ones that are bent over, I'm creating a shadow on the petal itself. And for the ones that are bent under it, the part that is bent under would pretty much be dark. There's not going to be too much of a highlight there. I'm really hoping you guys can follow that, because that didn't really make much sense to me. But I went in with my lightest color to get this paper saturated and to map out those darkest areas, because if you make a mistake, you can easily cover up the lightest color versus the darkest color. Went in with the darkest color, moving on to the two midtones, and then finishing back off with that lightest color again. And I definitely have this sped up, but you can kind of see that I'm not being overly careful with my coloring. There are some areas that kind of bled, especially with that mouse in the center on top of the mushroom. I'm not too concerned with it. I'm just going to kind of go with it, and you'll see why in the end. So next I'm going to go ahead and move on to this. No, I lie again. I'm going to color the center of the flower, and I want this to make it look as if it's raised up a little bit. So I'm concentrating my shading being towards the bottom and keeping my highlight on the top portion. That will make it look like it's raised up. Now we're going to move on to the mushroom, and I'm going to bring in some R80 markers. Again, starting off with my lightest color to map out those darkest areas. The stem of the mushroom is a round object, so I'm going to keep a center highlight here, but also create a shadow where he's holding on to the mushroom. For the top part of the mushroom, that's also a round object, so I'm going to concentrate my shading being on either side, as well as underneath that top mouse's little feet there, because he would cast a shadow onto the mushroom. I'm being careful going around these little polka dots because I'm using R markers. R markers are very difficult to take away or cover up, so I'm being just extremely careful. If I was using a different color combination here, I wouldn't be as careful, because I knew that I could kind of take some of it away or move some of it around if needed. Going in with the R85 and just extending these areas out a little bit further, including the shadows underneath that little mouse's feet and underneath the bottom mouse's little hands there. Again, keeping a center highlight, and you can see that the highlight for the stem is pretty small, and that's okay. Leaving a very small highlight is still going to give you that contrast you're looking for. Typically, the lightest color and the darkest color are the least amount that I use whenever coloring an object. So going to bring in some YR markers for the little polka dots on the mushroom, as well as the part that's underneath the top part of the mushroom. Again, I'm sure this has a technical term that I should have Googled before I did my voiceover, but I'm going right in with the darkest color because I have the rest of it colored. And like I said before, those R markers are very hard to fix. So to avoid the risk of having my colors bleed, I go right in with my darkest color, and I'm just adding shading the same way as I did before. So if the polka dots are off to the side of the mushroom, those are mostly going to be dark. The polka dots in the center would be a little bit lighter, so I added a little bit less shading in those areas. So next we're going to move on to the butterfly, and I'm going to use the same RV markers and the same V markers that I used for the first two flowers. Just added two different YG markers for the little body of the butterfly. Gonna go in with the V markers first, and I'm just concentrating my shading being towards the base of the wings, I guess, in each one of these little sections. But I'm using the same four colors that I used on that purple flower. And then I'll bring in the same RV markers that I used on that first flower that we colored to basically just color around these purple areas. I went right in with my darkest color this time, again, just to kind of avoid the risk of having my colors bleed. I also created just a little bit of a shadow where that one wing is in front of the other. It's such a teeny tiny area. I really wouldn't be too concerned about adding shadows where shadows need to be in such a small area, or else you're going to lose your highlight. You're going to run out of room for that highlight. So don't be overly concerned if you don't add shadows where they necessarily would be. So once that is done, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the daisies, and I'm not going to show you all of these daisies because I colored them all the same exact way. Starting off with my lightest color to get my paper saturated. Then I'm going in with the YR marker, YR68, which is a pretty dark orange. And I'm just adding a teeny tiny bit on the base of the petals, extending that out with the Y38 a little bit, then the Y35, and leaving the tips of the flowers for that Y04 that we had started off with. Now for the centers of the flowers, I wanted these to appear a little bit more orange. So I'm going to bring in my YR18, YR16, and bring back that Y38, which is a Y marker, but honestly, it's a little bit more orange than it is yellow. So I went ahead and colored all of the daisies the same way with the same color combinations. And I'm just going to show you the color combination that I used for the leaves and stems of the daisies, which are a little bit different than what I used for the flowers up in front. Again, starting off with my lightest color to get the paper saturated. For these leaves, they are curved just like that first one. So I am putting my shading on the tip and the base of these leaves, keeping a center highlight. For the stems, because they're behind everything, it's kind of hard to see where the shadows would be. So I just picked random areas. And in the end, you can't even tell. So if you're not sure and it's not something that's going to be, this is more of a background for me. So this isn't going to be my main focus of my card. So if I put shading in the wrong spot, if I can't tell, neither can anybody else. So I went ahead and colored all of the stems and the leaves with that same color combinations, and we're going to move on to the ground here. So I'm going to kind of go, well, first I'm going in with my lightest color, and I'm kind of determining how far back I want to go with my ground. And I'm just picking a spot basically where my images stop or where there is no gaps, because I figured that that's a good stopping point. So I'm getting the paper saturated with my lightest color. Then I'm going to bring in my E37, and I'm going to add shadows underneath each one of my little mice here. And then it's not really a shadow, but I'm adding some color underneath where the flower stems come out of the ground, just because usually this area would be a little bit darker on the ground anyway. Then bringing in the E35, and I'm going to extend those shadows out a little bit further. And I'm also going to start adding color to the back area of where my ground would actually end or begin, depending on how you're looking at it. Because the further away the object is, the darker it will appear. So the front would appear the lightest. So I'm going to extend all of those areas out with the E33 next, including the back area of where my ground ends. Next with the E31, doing the same exact thing, extending those shadows and bringing the back a little bit closer to the front. And then finally going back in with that E30 and going over the entire area, making sure that I have all of those shadows blended out. Finally, I'm going to add a little bit of texture here. So I'm just taking my E37 and my E35, I believe I used, and I'm just adding little dots, and I'm just using the tip of the marker, barely touching the tip of the marker to the paper, and I'm just kind of picking some random areas. And then I'm going to quickly go over those areas again with that E30 to just kind of blend those out a little bit and make them I don't want to say noticeable, but right now they kind of look like they don't belong there. So this will kind of fade them into the background a little bit. So next I'm going to go in with my B00 marker, and I'm going to cover up the entire area in the background, including around each one of my images. And this is where it will kind of fix all of your coloring mistakes. Because it's such a light color, you have to kind of look at this as if it's a colorless blender. It's going to take away any areas that you went out of the lines, but you also have to be very careful that you don't actually touch the image with the blue marker because you're going to drag that color out. If it's a light color like a yellow or anything like that, I'm not worried about it. But if you touch that pink or that purple, you're going to drag that color out. So I went around all of my images, and for the top, I'm going to go basically straight across the card panel, up and then back down. You will want to go over this twice because you're going to get those streaky lines. You'll also want to make sure that your marker is completely filled before you do this. And I keep turning the marker. So I use one side of the nib, then I'll turn the marker and use the other side of the nib. Even though my marker is filled, sometimes that nib can get a little bit dry when you're covering such a large area. So once all of that was done, I kind of went in and fixed up any of the areas that I could see any little streakies in there. And then I added a few white gel pen details, rubbed that on my finger to kind of get that ink flowing. Sometimes they can get a little clogged, and just rubbing that on your finger will kind of warm up the tip of that gel pen. Also added a few extra dots on the ground as well. And finally, we're going to go ahead and stamp out our sentiment. I didn't do anything special with the sentiment because I figured we got a lot going on in this card. Stamping that with black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp right there in the center top portion of my card. And then finally took a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen to add sparkle to the flowers and the little mushroom just in the front. Because I felt like there was really a lot going on here, I wanted these to stand out a little bit and kind of be different from the rest of the flowers. But that is it. That is our card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by. I will leave all of the supplies listed below. Bye.